June of 1942. The southern sector of the Soviet-German front stretched from Kursk to Taganrog for almost 700 kilometers. After the failed offensive near Kharkov, the Red Army was licking its wounds, while the German command was preparing a new strike. Hitler craved the oil of the Caucasus and the bread of the Kuban. Operation Blau was to be the decisive blow in the south. Army Group South numbered over 1 million soldiers, 1,500 tanks, and almost 2,000 aircraft. Against them stood the troops of the Bryansk, southwestern, and southern fronts. About 800,000 fighters with 1,000 tanks. Soviet divisions were exhausted by previous battles, many numbering 3,000 to 4,000 men instead of the prescribed 10. The command underestimated the scale of the impending offensive, considering it a diversionary maneuver before a new assault on Moscow. Intelligence reported on the concentration of enemy forces, but the true intentions of the enemy remained a mystery. June 28, 1942, 4 o'clock in the morning. The silence of the Don steppes was shattered by the roar of artillery cannonade. 2,000 German guns unleashed fire on the positions of General Parsagov's 40th Army. The earth trembled under the impact of shells. Trenches turned into mass graves. 0 hour for Operation Blau had struck. Colonel General Hermann Hoth, commander of the 4th Panzer Army, observed the artillery preparation from his command post. His tank divisions were already arrayed in battle formation, ready for the breakthrough. The objective was clear: Voronezh, a key hub of Soviet defense on the Don. After an hour and a half of artillery bombardment, the tanks went on the attack. 400 combat vehicles of General Nering's 24th Panzer Corps advanced on the positions of the 107th Rifle Division. Soviet soldiers, dazed by the artillery barrage, were unable to offer organized resistance. Anti-tank guns were destroyed, communications disrupted, commanders shell-shocked or killed. By noon, German tanks had broken through the defenses on a 20-kilometer front. The headquarters of the 40th Army lost control of its troops. Radio stations were silent, telephone lines were cut. General Parsagov understood. Catastrophe was inevitable. There were no reserves, and German tank wedges were already rushing deep into the defenses. By evening, the advanced units of the 4th Panzer Army had advanced 40 kilometers. The path to Voronezh was open. Soviet units retreated in panic, abandoning equipment and supplies. Roads became choked with refugees and retreating troops. German aviation strafed the columns with impunity, sowing chaos and death. The first day of Operation Blau became a black day for the Red Army. On July 1, 1942, German tanks continued to press towards Voronezh. In 3 days of offensive, Hoth's 4th Panzer Army had already advanced over 100 kilometers. General Parsagov's 40th Army had virtually ceased to exist as an organized force. Remnants of divisions were retreating to the Don in scattered groups, having lost contact with command. General Parsagov desperately tried to gather the surviving units into a fist, but control over the troops was irretrievably lost. Radios were silent. Headquarters were evacuating. Division commanders did not know where their neighbors were. A huge cauldron formed in the area of Stary Oskol, into which the remnants of the 107th and 121st Rifle Divisions fell. About 15,000 Red Army soldiers found themselves encircled. The commander of the 107th Division, Colonel Akimov, received an order to break through to the east at all costs, but his units were demoralized and bled white. German tankers methodically tightened the ring, cutting off escape routes. Soviet soldiers fought with the desperation of the doomed, but the forces were too unequal. By the evening of July 2nd, resistance in the cauldron practically ceased. Thousands of soldiers laid down their arms, unable to withstand continuous attacks from the air and ground. The general headquarters of the Supreme Command feverishly sought ways to stop the German breakthrough. Army General Vasilevsky ordered the commander of the Voronezh front, Lieutenant General Golikov, to organize a counterattack with the forces of the 24th Tank Corps. But this corps existed only on paper. Most of its vehicles had been lost back in May near Kharkov. Golikov had no real reserves. German planes dominated the air, unpunishedly attacking retreating columns. Roads turned into cemeteries of burned equipment and dead horses. Panic gripped entire units. Soldiers threw down their weapons and scattered to their homes. Officers lost control over their subordinates, and those who tried to restore order often became victims of their own soldiers. Military police shot deserters right on the roads, but this only intensified the chaos. On July 4, advanced units of General Nering's 24th Tank Corps reached the outskirts of Voronezh. The ancient city on the Don, one of the key nodes of Soviet defense, found itself under mortal threat. July 5, 1942. Dawn over Voronezh greeted the city with the smoke of fires and the roar of artillery. German tanks of General Nering's 24th Panzer Corps burst into the western districts of the ancient city on the Don. Residents fled their homes in a panic, grabbing only the essentials. Streams of refugees flowed through the streets, mixing with retreating Red Army soldiers. Lieutenant General Golikov, commander of the Voronezh front, understood the criticality of the situation. The loss of the city would open a direct road for the Germans to the Don, and further to the Caucasus. All available reserves were urgently pulled together. Colonel Zygin's 194th Rifle Division took up defensive positions in the right bank part of Voronezh. Soldiers dug in among the ruins of houses, turning every block into a fortress. German tanks slowly advanced along the narrow streets, suffering losses from anti-tank rifles and Molotov cocktails. Urban battles had their own specifics. Here, the advantage of heavy machinery was nullified, and the training of infantry played a decisive role. Soviet submachine gunners fired from basements and attics, causing the enemy unexpected losses. By noon on July 6th, the Germans had captured most of the right bank, but their advance slowed. Every house had to be taken by storm, every street became a battlefield. General Goth ordered to force the Don on the move, without allowing Soviet troops to consolidate on the eastern bank. Sappers began to build a pontoon bridge near Chizovka under fire. Soviet artillery, hidden on the left bank, methodically shelled the crossing. Shells exploded in the water, raising columns of spray. Pontoons sank one after another, carrying German soldiers and equipment into the murky waters of the Don. The commander of the 194th Division, Colonel Zygin, organized a counterattack with 2 regiments. Red Army soldiers in a bayonet charge drove the enemy out of several blocks, but could not hold their positions. German aviation continuously bombed Soviet positions, turning residential buildings into piles of ruins. By evening, the battles took on a particularly fierce character. The Germans sought to capture a bridgehead on the eastern bank at all costs, and Soviet units resisted equally stubbornly. The Don became a natural line that could not be surrendered. The fate of the entire southern wing of the Soviet-German front depended on the outcome of the battle for Voronezh. July 7, 1942. In the cellars of the Kremlin, in his office at a massive oak table, Stalin was studying reports from the front. The dispatches were catastrophic. Voronezh had fallen. German tanks were breaking through to the Don. The 40th Army was routed. The Supreme Commander picked up the direct line to Army General Vasilevsky. His voice was calm, but every word sounded like a verdict. Immediately organize a planned retreat across the Don. Preserve combat-ready units at all costs, and hold the crossings. Vasilevsky understood. The decision had not come easily to Stalin. Every kilometer of retreat meant new casualties, loss of territory, demoralization of troops. But there was no alternative. Continued resistance on the western bank threatened the complete annihilation of the southern grouping. At 9:30 in the morning, Directive number 170412 was sent from the General Staff. The commanders of the Voronezh, southwestern and southern fronts were ordered to immediately begin an organized withdrawal of troops across the Don River. Lieutenant General received the order first. The Voronezh front was to withdraw to the Zadonsk-Lisky line, holding the crossings in the Semiluki area. Every bridge, every ferry crossing was of strategic importance. Golikov summoned the army commanders. In the half-destroyed staff building, under the roar of German artillery, officers bent over maps. Red arrows marked retreat routes, blue circles, strongholds for cover. The commander of the 6th Army, Lieutenant General Gorodniansky, was tasked with organizing the defense of the crossings near Lisky. His divisions were to hold the eastern bank at all costs until the main forces arrived. Sappers were already mining the bridges, ready to blow them up at the appearance of German tanks. Simultaneously, the evacuation of military depots began. Thousands of tons of ammunition, fuel, food were loaded onto trains and vehicles. What could not be evacuated was to be destroyed. Major General Rokossovsky, commander of the 16th Tank Corps, received orders to cover the retreat. His surviving 30 tanks were to hold back the German vanguards, giving the infantry time for an organized withdrawal. Every hour of delay could cost thousands of lives. The Don was becoming the last hope for salvation. While Hoth's 4th Panzer Army stormed Voronezh, an equally dramatic battle unfolded to the south. General Feldmarschall Friedrich Paulus, commander of the 6th Army, received orders to strike the positions of the southwestern front. His objective was clear: to break through Soviet defenses in the Stary Oskol area and advance towards the Don, securing the southern flank of Army Group South. On the morning of July 8, 1942, German artillery unleashed fire upon the positions of Lieutenant General Gordov's 21st Army. Over 1,000 guns methodically churned Soviet trenches, transforming defensive lines into a lunar landscape. Colonel Batyuk's 161st Rifle Division bore the brunt of the initial assault. German shells exploded with deafening roars, burying trenches with earth and debris. Communication with regiments was severed within the first minutes of the shelling. Radios went out of commission. Telephone cables were torn by shrapnel. From his dugout, Colonel Batyuk attempted to direct the defense, but command of the troops was practically lost. After a 2-hour artillery preparation, tanks of General Huba's 14th Panzer Corps went on the offensive. 300 combat vehicles advanced on Soviet infantry positions in a broad front. The ground trembled under the tracks of heavy tanks, raising clouds of dust. Red Army soldiers, stunned by the artillery bombardment, slowly regained their senses. Many anti-tank guns were destroyed, their crews killed or shell-shocked. Those guns that survived opened fire on the advancing vehicles, but there were too few of them. German tank crews, seasoned veterans of the Polish and French campaigns, methodically suppressed pockets of resistance. By noon, the defense of the 161st Division was breached along a 15-kilometer section. The remnants of the regiments retreated into the depths, losing contact with each other. General Gordov urgently committed reserves, but they melted away under the blows of German aviation even before reaching the front line. Messerschmitts and Stukas attacked Soviet columns with impunity, turning roads into cemeteries of burnt equipment. By evening, German tanks had advanced 25 kilometers deep into Soviet defenses. July 9, 1942. The Don steppes turned into a huge mousetrap for thousands of Soviet soldiers. While the command's attention was riveted on the battles for Voronezh, a tragedy unfolded to the south, the scale of which would only become clear days later. Wehrmacht tank wedges, like giant pincers, tightened around the retreating units of the 21st and 28th Armies. Lieutenant General Gordov, commander of the 21st Army, lost contact with half of his divisions. The radio airwaves were filled with fragments of messages, cries for help, and the last reports from encircled headquarters. The first cauldron formed in the Milarovo area. The remnants of the 161st and 307th Rifle Divisions, about 12,000 men, found themselves cut off from the main forces. Colonel Batyuk, commander of the 161st Division, gathered the surviving commanders in a half-ruined school on the outskirts of the city. The maps were stained with the blood of a wounded signalman, but the situation was clear. There was no way out. German tanks blocked all roads to the east, and from the north and south, infantry divisions tightened the ring. The attempt to break through began on the night of July 10th. Colonel Batyuk led his soldiers in a last attack, hoping to break a gap in the German lines. Red Army soldiers charged with bayonets under the cover of darkness, but the enemy was ready. Machine guns mowed down the advancing men like grass. Flares turned night into day, snatching the figures of attacking soldiers from the darkness. By dawn, the offensive had choked. Hundreds of bodies littered the field in front of German positions. Colonel Batyuk was severely wounded and captured. His division ceased to exist. To the south, near Kantemirovka, another tragedy unfolded. Units of the 28th Army of Lieutenant General Ryabyshev, retreating from the border, ran into German roadblocks. General Hubei's 14th Panzer Corps cut off their retreat routes to the Don. The 38th and 199th Rifle Divisions, more than 15,000 soldiers and commanders, found themselves encircled. Major General Kotov, commander of the 38th Division, received the last order from Army headquarters by radio: to break through in small groups to save people and equipment. An organized breakthrough was no longer possible. The division broke up into separate detachments, each of which tried to independently escape the encirclement. German pilots hunted scattered groups of Red Army soldiers like game. Messerschmitts dived on columns of refugees, shooting everyone indiscriminately. The roads were littered with abandoned carts, burned cars, and the bodies of people and horses. Many soldiers, losing hope of salvation, simply threw down their weapons and surrendered. Major General Kotov shot himself, unwilling to fall into enemy hands. His adjutant burned all documents and the division's banners. By July 15th, resistance in the cauldrons had practically ceased. Tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers streamed along dusty roads to German prisoner-of-war camps. Many of them would never see their homes again. July 10th, 1942. A tense atmosphere reigned at the headquarters of the Voronezh front. Lieutenant General Golikov hunched over a map covered with red and blue markers. The red ones marked German units, the blue ones, Soviet. There were more and more red ones, and fewer blue ones. The order to retreat had already been received. Now it was necessary to organize the withdrawal in such a way as to preserve the maximum number of people and equipment. The Chief of Staff of the front, Major General Kazakov, was reading out reports from the field. Communication with units was being restored slowly. Many divisions had been silent for 24 hours. Golikov understood that there was no time to waste. Every hour of delay meant new losses, new encirclements, new thousands of prisoners. The first order of business was to determine the routes of withdrawal and assign rearguards. The commander summoned Major General Chistyakov, commander of the 21st Tank Corps. He had only 40 serviceable vehicles left, but it was these tanks that were to cover the infantry's retreat. Chistyakov was tasked with holding the crossings in the Semiluki area until the main forces arrived. His tankmen were to become a living shield between the retreating divisions and the German pursuers. Simultaneously, preparations for engineering barriers began. Sappers of the 37th Engineering Battalion under the command of Major Voronov received orders to mine all bridges across the Don. Explosives were laid so that the crossings could be destroyed with the push of a button. But until Soviet troops crossed, the bridges had to remain intact. Major Voronov personally checked every charge, every wire. A mistake could cost the lives of thousands of retreating soldiers. In the rear, a grandiose evacuation was unfolding. Quartermaster services worked around the clock, evacuating ammunition and food depots. Colonel Semyonov, the front's chief of logistics, coordinated the loading. Railway trains departed one after another to the east, carrying tons of shells, cartridges, and fuel. What could not be loaded was destroyed on the spot. Explosions at the depots thundered all night, illuminating the sky with ominous flashes. July 11, 1942. Dawn over the Don met the river in the smoke of fires and the roar of cannonade. Semiluki, a small town 40 kilometers south of Voronezh, suddenly became an arena of fierce fighting. Here passed one of the few crossings capable of letting retreating troops pass to the eastern bank. Major General Chistyakov, with his 40 tanks, took up defensive positions on the approaches to the bridge. His 21st Tank Corps now existed only on paper, but these last machines had to hold the crossing at all costs. German scouts had already appeared on the outskirts of the town, looking for Soviet positions. Major Voronov, commander of the 37th Engineering Battalion, personally checked the charges under the bridge. Tons of explosives were laid in the supports, but they could only be detonated after the last Soviet units had crossed to the eastern bank. Sappers worked under constant shelling from German artillery. Shells burst in the water, raising columns of spray. Shrapnel whistled over the heads of the soldiers. Senior Lieutenant Kuznetsov, commander of the Sapper Company, supervised the installation of the charges. His men crawled under the bridge spans, attaching explosives to the metal structures. One wrong step, one spark from a splinter, and the bridge would blow up along with the sappers. At noon, the first groups of retreating troops reached the crossing. The remnants of Colonel Zygin's 194th Rifle Division crossed the Don under continuous enemy fire. The soldiers ran across the bridge, ducking from the whistling bullets and shrapnel. The wounded were carried on ground sheets. The seriously ill were loaded onto carts. German assault aircraft dived onto the crossing, dropping bombs into the muddy waters of the river. Lieutenant Morozov's anti-aircraft gunners responded with fire from their cannons, but there were too many planes. Captain Belov's pontoon bridge builders were deploying an additional crossing 2 kilometers downstream. Rubber boats and wooden rafts were supposed to speed up the evacuation of troops, but German aviation methodically hunted for every floating craft. Messerschmitts darted over the river, firing at everything that moved on the water. Captain Belov was among the first to die when a fragment of an aerial bomb tore him in half right on the pontoon. By evening, the situation became critical. German tanks appeared on the western outskirts of Semiluki, methodically suppressing Soviet firing points. Major General Chistyakov understood. His machines would not last long. Ammunition was running out. Fuel remained for an hour of battle, and the enemy outnumbered them tenfold. July 12, 1942. While the main attention of the Soviet command was focused on the battles for Voronezh and the crossings over the Don in the central sector of the front, a no less dramatic battle was unfolding in the south. Colonel General Ewald von Kleist, commander of the 1st Panzer Army, received orders to deliver a decisive blow against the positions of the southern front. His objective was crystal clear: to break through the Soviet defenses and rush towards Rostov-on-Don, a key transportation hub in southern Russia. The loss of this city would mean disaster for the Red Army. The Germans would have a direct route to the Caucasus and to the oil fields of Grozny and Baku. Lieutenant General Malinovsky, commander of the Southern Front, understood the criticality of the situation. His 9th and 37th Armies had to hold the approaches to Rostov at all costs, but the forces were unequal. Against 800,000 Soviet soldiers, Kleist could field 1 million soldiers, 1,500 tanks, and powerful air support. On the morning of July 13th, German artillery unleashed a barrage of fire on the positions of Major General Karatanov's 9th Army. 1,200 guns methodically plowed through Soviet trenches in the Milarovo area. The earth trembled under the impact of heavy shells, transforming the defensive lines into a lunar landscape. Colonel Gorlov's 267th Rifle Division was the first to bear the brunt of the onslaught. Communication with the regiments was cut off in the first minutes of the shelling. Telephone cables were severed by shrapnel. Radio stations went out of order. Colonel Gorlov, from his command post, tried to coordinate the defense, but control of the troops was practically lost. After a 3-hour artillery preparation, the tanks of General Mackinson's 3rd Motorized Corps went on the attack. 400 combat vehicles moved towards the Soviet positions, raising clouds of dust. Red Army soldiers, deafened by the artillery barrage, slowly regained their senses. Most of the anti-tank guns were destroyed, their crews killed or concussed. German tank crews methodically suppressed surviving firing points, paving the way for the infantry. By noon, the defenses of the 267th Division had been breached on a 20-kilometer front. The remnants of the regiments rolled back to the east, losing contact with command and with each other. July 23, 1942, Rostov-on-Don, an ancient city at the confluence of the Don and the Sea of Azov, was preparing for its last day under Soviet rule. The streets, where civilians had recently hurried to work, now turned into defense positions. Major General Karatonov, commander of the 9th Army, understood the hopelessness of the situation. His exhausted divisions were retreating towards the city under continuous attacks from Kleist's 1st Panzer Army. There were no reserves, ammunition was running out, and German tanks had already appeared on the western outskirts. At the headquarters of the Southern Front, Lieutenant General Malinovsky bent over a map. The enemy's red arrows converged on Rostov from 3 sides, leaving only one retreat route to the east. The loss of the city meant not just another defeat. It was the collapse of the entire defense in the south. Rostov was called the gateway to the Caucasus, and now these gates were about to open before the Wehrmacht. Colonel Selivanov, commander of the 207th Rifle Division, received orders to organize the defense of the central districts. His soldiers dug in among residential buildings, turning every street into a firing line. Women and children hastily left their apartments, taking only the essentials. Stations were crowded with refugees, trains left overflowing. Those who had not managed to evacuate hid in basements, praying for a speedy end to the fighting. German aircraft bombed city blocks with impunity. Junkers dropped high-explosive bombs on residential buildings, turning them into piles of rubble. Fires blazed throughout the city. Smoke covered the sky. Fire departments could not cope with the raging inferno. There were not enough people, equipment, or water. Many buildings burned for days, illuminating the night sky with an ominous glow. By the evening of July 24th, German tanks broke into the southern districts of Rostov. The crews of General Mackinson's 3rd Motorized Corps methodically advanced through the streets, suppressing pockets of resistance. Soviet submachine gunners fired from windows and basements, but the forces were too uneven. Every block had to be abandoned after a short fight. Colonel Selivanov understood. It was impossible to hold the city. His division was melting away before his eyes, losses numbering in the hundreds of killed and wounded. Communication with neighboring units was cut off. Ammunition was running low. There was only one thing left: to retreat in an organized manner across the Don, saving the men for future battles. Captain Volkov's sappers laid explosives under the bridges across the Don. Tons of ammonal were placed in the supports, ready to destroy the crossings with a single explosion. But until Soviet troops crossed, the bridges had to remain intact. The captain personally checked each charge, each detonating wire. An error could lead to the death of thousands of retreating soldiers. On the night of July 25th, the evacuation began. The remnants of the 9th Army stretched towards the crossings under the cover of darkness. The soldiers walked in silence, understanding the bitterness of defeat. Many looked back at the burning city, where their comrades remained, their hopes for victory. the Don became the last frontier between the retreating troops and German tanks. July 26, 1942. Over the Don steppes, an aerial battle unfolded, its scale eclipsing all previous sky engagements. The 4th Air Fleet of General Richthofen, numbering over 1,200 aircraft, received orders to secure air superiority and support the advancing tank groups. Against them rose the remnants of the aviation of 3 Soviet fronts. About 400 machines, many of which were outdated types. Major General Krasovsky, commander of the air forces of the Voronezh front, understood the hopelessness of the situation. His pilots fought with the desperation of the doomed, knowing that every downed German aircraft could save the lives of hundreds of retreating comrades. Captain Pokrishkin, in his Yak-1, engaged in an unequal battle with a quartet of Messerschmitts over the crossing at Semaluki. The German fighters attacked in unison, utilizing their advantage in speed and armament. Pokrishkin maneuvered among the clouds, trying to get on the enemy's tail. But he had only 10 minutes of fuel left. With one accurate hit, he shot down the leading German of the quartet, but was immediately caught in enemy fire himself. Bullets pierced the fuel tank, and the pilot barely managed to reach his airfield. IL-2 attack aircraft of Senior Lieutenant Rudelsky attacked a German tank column in the Ostrogozhsk area. 8 aircraft flew at treetop level, firing at enemy equipment with cannons and machine guns. RS-82 rockets exploded among the tanks, raising columns of smoke and flame. But German anti-aircraft artillery was ready for them. 88mm guns opened dense fire, turning the sky into a solid wall of explosions. 3 attack aircraft crashed into the steppe, engulfed in flames. Rudelsky brought his machine to the target, despite holes in the wings and fuselage. His cannons hit 2 German tanks, but on the way back, the plane was shot down by a fighter. The pilot died in the burning cockpit, unable to eject. German Junkers 88s methodically bombed the crossings over the Don. Pilots of the 2nd Squadron of KG-51, under the command of Major Steinhoff, struck from an altitude of 3,000 meters, dropping high-explosive bombs on bridges and pontoon crossings. Explosions raised water columns several tens of meters high. Pontoons shattered into splinters, carrying Soviet soldiers and equipment into the muddy waters of the Don. Anti-aircraft gunners of Lieutenant Morozov desperately fought off air attacks, but their 37mm guns were largely ineffective against high-altitude bombers. July 27, 1942. In the cellars of the Kremlin, Stalin received the report he feared most. Rostov-on-Don had fallen. The gates to the Caucasus lay open before the Wehrmacht. The casualty figures shocked even the seasoned Supreme Commander. Over a month of fighting, the Voronezh-Voroshilovgrad Operation had devoured entire armies. General Parsagov's 40th Army ceased to exist. Of 70,000 men, only 12,000 reached the Don. Gordov's 21st Army lost 2/3 of its personnel. Karitonov's 9th Army retreated beyond the Don as a pathetic remnant. Total losses exceeded 350,000 killed, wounded, and missing. Thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and vehicles remained on the battlefields or fell into enemy hands. Army General Vasilevsky read the reports in a monotonous voice. But behind each figure lay human destinies. Colonel Batyuk of the 161st Division died in a German hospital from his wounds. Major General Kotov shot himself, unwilling to be captured. Captain Belov died at the pontoon crossing near Semaluki. Thousands of junior commanders and ordinary soldiers remained forever in the Don steppes. But the most terrible thing was not the casualty figures, but the reasons for the defeat. An analysis conducted by the General Staff revealed systemic errors that nearly led to the complete collapse of the southern flank of the front. Intelligence underestimated the scale of the German offensive. The command of the fronts acted in an uncoordinated manner. Communication between headquarters was intermittent. Reserves were committed to battle piecemeal, without a unified plan. Air defense proved incapable of protecting retreating troops. Engineering preparation of defensive lines was carried out formally. Many division and regimental commanders simply did not know how to act in modern warfare. The experience of the First World War was outdated, and new tactics had not yet been developed. German tank wedges sliced through the Soviet defenses like a knife through butter. Coordination between branches of service was absent. Artillery could not support the infantry, aviation acted independently, and tanks were committed to battle without reconnaissance. The result was predictable: rout and retreat. The psychological impact of the defeat was no less devastating than the material losses. The morale of the troops dropped to a critical level. Soldiers lost faith in victory. Officers lost faith in their own abilities. Desertion became widespread. Military police could not cope with the flow of fugitives. Many units simply disintegrated, unable to withstand the moral pressure. The defeat was especially hard on young soldiers, fighting for the first time. They saw tanks burning, planes falling, comrades dying, and broke psychologically. Experienced frontline soldiers held up better, but even among them, defeatist sentiments grew. Commanders lost authority. Orders were carried out formally or ignored altogether. August 1942 became a month of bitter conclusions for the Soviet command. In the General Staff offices, officers analyzed the causes of the catastrophe, trying to learn lessons from the bloody experience of the summer retreat. Army General Vasilevsky personally led the commission that studied every episode of the battles from Voronezh to Rostov. Documents testified to systemic problems that led to the defeat of entire armies. The main flaw lay in outdated tactics. The Red Army was still fighting with World War I methods, while the enemy had already mastered the principles of blitzkrieg. German tank wedges easily broke through linear defenses, and Soviet commanders did not know how to counter the enemy's mobile groups. Coordination between branches of service was practically non-existent. Artillery operated on pre-planned targets without taking into account the real situation. Aviation fought on its own. Tanks were committed to battle without infantry support. The result was predictable: scattered strikes instead of coordinated actions. The losses of command personnel were particularly painful. Hundreds of experienced officers died or were captured, taking with them invaluable combat experience. Young lieutenants, released from accelerated courses, could not replace career military personnel. They lacked knowledge, experience, and authority among their subordinates. Communication between headquarters worked terribly. Radios failed from the first shells. Telephone cables were torn by shrapnel. Division commanders lost control of regiments. Army commanders did not know where their units were. In the conditions of modern warfare, this meant certain death. Intelligence proved incapable of uncovering the true intentions of the enemy. The agent network was weak. Aerial reconnaissance was insufficient. The Germans managed to conceal the scale of the impending offensive, which came as a complete surprise to the Soviet command. Engineering preparation of the terrain was carried out formally. Anti-tank ditches were too shallow. Minefields were sparse. Pillboxes were weak. When the offensive began, all these obstacles did not hold up German tanks even for an hour. But the most terrible factor was morale. Troops, accustomed to the victories of the winter of '41, were not ready for new defeats. Panic gripped entire divisions. Soldiers threw down their weapons and scattered. Officers lost control over their subordinates. Discipline collapsed. Stalin demanded immediate changes in troop organization and combat tactics. A special commission was created under the leadership of Marshal Shaposhnikov to develop new regulations and instructions. The experience of the Don Retreat was to become the basis for future victories. August 23, 1942, the advance units of Paulus's 6th Army reached the banks of the Volga north of Stalingrad. A month of bloody battles from the Don to the Great Russian River concluded with the Wehrmacht reaching the main waterway of the Soviet Union. What began as Operation Blau, aimed at capturing the oil fields of the Caucasus, transformed into a drive to seize the city named after the Soviet leader. Colonel General Friedrich Paulus stood on the high bank, watching his tanks descend to the water. The goal seemed achievable. Only a few dozen kilometers remained to the center of Stalingrad. But the German commander did not yet suspect that his army was entering a battle that would mark the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. The Voronezh-Voroshilovgrad Operation, which cost the Red Army hundreds of thousands of lives, unexpectedly turned into a strategic trap for the Germans themselves. Stretching its communications over hundreds of kilometers, Army Group South found itself vulnerable to counterattacks. Stalin, studying maps in his Kremlin office, was already planning Operation Uranus, a grand offensive intended to encircle and destroy Paulus's army. The bitter experience of the summer retreat taught the Soviet command new tactics. There were no longer attempts to hold every line at any cost. Instead, troops received orders to wear down the enemy with tenacious defense, to force them into urban combat where the advantage of German tanks was reduced to zero. Every house in Stalingrad became a fortress, every street a battlefield. General Chuikov, appointed commander of the 62nd Army, implemented a new defense concept. His soldiers fought for every floor, every room, turning the city into a giant meat grinder. The events of the summer of 1942 forever changed the nature of the war. The Blitzkrieg, which brought the Germans victories in Poland and France, shattered against the resilience of Soviet soldiers and the boundless expanses of Russia. The road to Stalingrad, paved with the defeats of the Red Army, paradoxically led the Wehrmacht to its own demise. The historical significance of these events would only become clear months later, when the last defenders of the city on the Volga would turn the tide of the entire war.